If you want to turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 6, we're going to read through chapter 6. Sunday morning we touched on about the first half of the chapter. We'll finish it up this coming Sunday. But tonight we want to try and study through most of the chapter at least. So I'm going to start reading in verse 1 of chapter 6, if you want to follow along. It says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, 'We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God.' Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, 'O King Darius, live forever.' All the high officials in the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked.' Therefore King Darius signed the document and injunction. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, 'O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?' The king answered and said, 'The thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked.' Then they answered and said before the king, 'Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day.' Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, 'Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed.' Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, 'May your God whom you serve continually deliver you.' And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And he came near to the den where Daniel was. He cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, 'O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?' Then Daniel said to the king, 'O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before them, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm.' Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now let's back up and kind of walk through chapter 6, using our questions to do that. Question 1, what made Daniel's cohorts so irritated with him? So what made these people so angry that they wanted Daniel to be gone? Jealous. That was probably at the root of the major part of what was going on. What else possibly? Power. They wanted what Daniel was going to get or had gotten, which then plays into jealousy a little bit as well. What else possibly? Yeah. Remember, we've kind of talked about this throughout the chapters we've covered so far, but this is a story about God, not just Daniel. And so God brings the children of Israel into exile, but he uses them still to spread the news about him, about God. And so as Daniel does that through the life that he lives, Satan is still on the attack. The spiritual warfare we talk about. Satan is still on the attack, trying to destroy or prevent whatever God is doing, or prevent glory from coming to God. And so if he can destroy Daniel, then that would be accomplished. And he works through the lives of people to do that many times. What was their reaction to the situation? Was it a good reaction? You certainly hope people that become irritated with you don't have this type of reaction, right? I want you to think about the reaction that they have toward Daniel versus the reaction that the king has toward Daniel. Now, after the king makes the decree and the injunction as well, and he finds out that Daniel prays, what does the king want to do? Is he irritated with Daniel? Yeah, he's probably more angry with himself about this, and probably the guys as well, not Daniel, but the others. But he doesn't lash out at Daniel. He actually is really upset. And if you'll notice in the text, all day he tries to find a way to deliver Daniel out of this because he doesn't want to throw him to the den of lions. But the guys that create this whole mess, their reaction to Daniel is, let's get him out of the way because he's standing between what I want and where I'm at. And so let's get rid of him however we can. And they found that they couldn't find anything wrong with him unless they accuse him concerning his religion or his God. Notice that there's still, let's just say that, how many years have Daniel and the Israelites been in captivity at this point, or exiles? Yeah, probably about 65. It's thought that Daniel is in his 80s at this point, at least 80, which means if he was a teenager, mid-teens, approximately, when he was taken as a captive, then he would be about 65 years. Now notice, like you would think in 65 years, any form of, I'm going to use the word racism, I don't know that that's what this is, but if you'll notice, when they go to the king in verse 13, it says, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the, I'm in the wrong chapter, sorry. Let me get to chapter 6, so it would be better if I did. They identify him as one of the exiles, and let me find the right verse. It's 13. Thank you. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah. They don't just say Daniel, a guy that we want to eliminate. They say Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, which I guess in their thinking, they think that would make the king a little more open-eared to listen to what they have to say. Whether it does or not, we don't know. But apparently they still hold some type of grudge against the exiles, and especially probably since Daniel is in a high place, high-ranking official, you might say. Do we ever become irritated with others around us? And it's okay to say yes, because if you don't, you're lying. So it's better to go ahead and say yes, probably. We do become irritated with people sometimes, right? It's our personalities. Hopefully, we never have this type of reaction. But I would ask you, what is your reaction? Because we work with different people, they have different thoughts. Hopefully, when we come together or when we live as believers, we don't necessarily become irritated with believers. Hopefully, we don't. Hopefully, we recognize among believers that there is a Christ that unites us. We don't always agree or see things eye to eye, but we don't necessarily become irritated with believers. But when we think about those who are not believers, sometimes they do kind of irritate us because we want them to see why we live the way we live, and they just don't see it because they don't have Christ in their life. And therefore, it just kind of irritates us a little bit. But I think it's the irritation of we want them to know God, and they don't know Him. And hopefully that's our reaction, and we respond in a way that would share God with them. We don't find that these guys have a reaction that wants what is best for Daniel. Their reaction is to destroy him however they can. Your question 2 then. Had these people who are irritated at Daniel been watching him? Maybe for 65 years. Well, maybe since the Medes and Persians took over, because we don't really know. They may not have been around before that, but apparently they've been watching him for a period of time because they know that this is the only way to trap him. And they know that he goes and makes petition prayer 3 times a day. They've watched his life. What does that tell us practically about us as we live out the life that God's called us to live? Are people watching? Probably so. Why do you think they did not recognize that the life he lived, the God that he served, would have been good for them to live as well? So if they're watching Daniel, and they were, why did they not come to this understanding of, it would be better if I just lived my life like Daniel? Because ultimately, that, as a believer today, that's really what we want other people to see, isn't it? Remember Paul's words, follow me as I follow Christ? That's kind of what our motto should be as well. As I live like Christ, we want others to see that in us so that they live like Christ, but we're kind of the visual representation of that until they get that connection with God. Why do they not see that? Why do they not see that it would be better if I just live like Daniel lives? Okay. 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 Happy with where they were, maybe? Okay. We could say that there's a sense of they didn't know any better, maybe. Although Daniel's living the life in front of them, so you'd think hopefully they would see that, but they hadn't been taught from a child up. What did you say? Going against the king? Okay. There's something about us that changes when Christ enters our life. Now, understand Daniel wasn't living after Christ has come to the earth, but Daniel is living with the understanding of God as who he needs to serve. Something in his life has changed. And it happened a long time ago, because when he comes to Babylon then at that time as an exile, going back to chapter 1, he had a heart to serve God at that point in time. So this has been 65 years at least of him serving God faithfully. Until Christ enters someone's life today, they will see things from a worldly perspective. They will not see them from a godly perspective. And in fairness, they can't, because they don't have the Spirit living in them to make them realize what God provides to us. Somewhere along the way, we hope they find that. And we hope that they see it through us in order to get there. But if we're not careful, when we become irritated with people, if we don't have the right response, then they're not going to see God through us. So it's why it's so important for our response to be good. What do we find? How did Daniel respond when these guys made this accusation and then got the king to do what he did, and then they bring him in front of the king and he gets thrown into the lion's den? How did Daniel respond? Remain faithful. Okay. We don't have any, we don't see anything where it says he was kicking and screaming going into the den, right? What does he say? The only real response we can see is the next morning. And what does he say then? Yeah, look at verse 21 though. Go back before that one. Look at verse 21. Then Daniel said to the king, "King, I don't like you anymore." That's not what he says, is it? He says, "O king, live forever," which was an encouraging statement to the king. It was a statement of saying, I'm a friend with you. I'm not against you. Now, this is the king that has thrown him into the lion's den. And yet Daniel's coming out the next morning. Now, granted, he's not harmed in any way, but he's still coming out the next morning and saying, I'm friends with you. Go ahead, I want you to live forever. I don't find fault here necessarily. He says, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him." And then notice this last line. "And also before you, O king, I have done no harm." In other words, I don't have any plans against you. And I haven't had any plans against you. So Daniel, we find his response to be, I'm just taking this as this must be God's plan. And I'm going to be faithful through it just the same as I was faithful before the bad thing happened. I was faithful then, I'm going to be faithful through the bad thing, and I'm going to be faithful on the other side. That's kind of what we see from Daniel. We don't see him lashing out. We don't see him responding negatively to God. We don't see him taking it out on the king. We just see Daniel being steady as he goes. I think that's really important for us to see today. Because as people, maybe people who are not God followers, may try to create problems for us, they don't need to see us respond in a worldly way. They need to see us respond as godly as we can. And that's only done through the Spirit. In question 3 then, how many people seem to bring the case against Daniel to the king? Yeah, all of them. 122 if we had to throw a number on it. That would be the 120 satraps and then the 2 that were in the same level as what Daniel was before he gets elevated. So you got 122, but then it throws in that they actually bring in others as well. And they make this statement that you got to believe can't be exactly right. Maybe it is, but we also know that people have a tendency to exaggerate things when they're trying to prove a point. But they actually say to the king, let me find the verse. Verse 7, all the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, and the governors are agreed. When have you ever seen that many people agree on something? Maybe if it's to do harm to someone, maybe that's the only time. But you're talking about more than 122 at this point, because they brought in the governors, the counselors as well. And they are agreed, supposedly, they agree, king, that you should do this. Now, there's a lot of sweet talking going on here to get the king to do what they want him to do. And it's for their own gain. It's not for the king's gain. It's actually for the king's detriment. Because behind this, what seems to be going on, and what most scholars believe, is that these guys, these two other guys, probably were making some money off the kingdom somehow. And because of that, they didn't want to disrupt what they had going. And if Daniel becomes the guy in charge, Daniel's going to hold them accountable. And they're not going to be in the same position that they were. So they got to get Daniel out of here. Otherwise, this whole, if you want to call it Ponzi scheme, whatever it is, this whole deal where they're making some pretty good cash off the deal is probably going away. So it was for their detriment. It was for the king's benefit if Daniel gets to survive, but it was for the king's detriment if Daniel goes away. But the king didn't see that. Question 4 then, from verse 7, who all agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce the injunction? We've answered that. Is this sometimes the way things get presented today? They get embellished somewhat. Things are said that are not maybe 100% true, but it's close to true, so they get said, and it's just to try to persuade people to do what individuals want them to do, which is what was going on here. Question 5 then, when the leaders presented the plan to the king, how did they try to persuade him, or for what reason did they try to promote their idea? So how did they try to persuade him? Making him think it was in his best interest. They also come to him with the same statement that Daniel makes from a different perspective, though. This, O King Darius, live forever. In other words, they're really laying it on thick, right? You heard the old saying, you can catch more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. They're laying the honey on pretty thick right now. And so they're trying to sweet talk and persuade him. And it strokes his ego a little bit to think everyone is going to now make petition to me or pray to me or glorify me for the next 30 days. Can't do it to anyone else, it's just going to be to me. Kind of strokes a guy's ego a little bit, doesn't it? I'm not saying it's a good thing by any means, it's a terrible thing, but that's what they were doing. So question 6, what does verse 10 seem to tell us about the way Daniel prayed? This time in Scripture, was there a temple still standing? So let's answer the last part of that first. Was there a temple still standing in Jerusalem at this point in time?
No.
There was not. It had been destroyed. The ruins were there, but it was destroyed. So let's look then at how Daniel prays. Notice what Scripture tells us about that. Look at verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. What does Scripture tell us about everything around Daniel praying here? He was faithful. It wasn't something he started after this decree was made. It was something he had been doing. And we know that too because the guys that were trying to destroy him had seen this is the only way we're going to get him, done away with. So they knew that's what he would do. So we find that he was very faithful, consistent, we might say. He didn't waver. It seems that this was a daily thing for him to do. We know there's value in us daily approaching God and going before him, reading his word, but also praying to him as well. What else do we find from that verse concerning how Daniel prayed? He wasn't trying to hide it. He's in front of his window, right?
He probably had some idea that God would restore his kingdom or restore the temple based on the dream that he interpreted in previous chapters.
Okay. Maybe.
He prayed towards Jerusalem because the temple represents the presence of God, so his prayers were directed to God.
Yeah. So he looks out his window toward Jerusalem. Because if you remember, in Old Testament times, the temple was extremely important to the Jewish community, Israelite community. And what was it inside the temple that was so important to them? Holy of Holies. And inside the Holy of Holies was what? The Ark of the Covenant. And on the Ark of the Covenant, there were two angels on each end, right? And what resided between them when his presence came? God. So when Daniel looks toward Jerusalem, he is looking toward the representation of God. He's not taking his eyes off of it. He knows that he needs to be looking there. Because a case could be made, why doesn't he just move over outside the window to where people can't see what he's doing, or just close the window, assuming he could do that? Why doesn't he just move over? Still look toward Jerusalem, but not necessarily out the window. Why not do that? Could be reverence for God. What else could it be? Strong faith, okay. Did he want to take his eyes off God at that point in time? Now, I understand that he's not looking toward Jerusalem and seeing an image of God, so to speak, right? But it is the only representation that they have of God's residing among them is where the temple was in Jerusalem. Daniel, for sure at this point, because he knows he's still going to pray, and he knows at some point they're going to make this accusation against him. For us to think that Daniel was just going about life without any thought of what this is going to mean to him, he knows something's coming. He knows that he's probably going to face the lion's den. Has God told him that literally? Probably not. But at the same time, he knows he's going to keep doing what he's doing, and he knows what the injunction is, and that's going to be thrown into the lion's den. So he keeps doing it. And the worst thing he could do at this point is take his eyes off God. Now, what I think is so important for us to see is not that he kept his eyes on God now, but his eyes had been on God the whole time. But he sure doesn't take his eyes off of him now. And so he keeps looking. And I don't think he's doing this just so people would see him do that. I don't think that's what he's doing. I think he's just doing it because that's who he is. The same way that you and I should live our life for Christ, because that's who we are. Not because we want other people to just see that we look like Christ or we look like Paul, whatever you want to use that for, but because we want people to just recognize it's who we are, it's who we believe in. I think that's what Daniel was doing here.
Also, had he moved over a little so no one could see him, he would have been putting that new law over God.
Yes.
Like, I'll pray, but only if people can't see me.
Yeah. So do we ever make, if you couldn't hear what she said if he would have moved over or shut the window or whatever, then he would have been valuing the law over God. And ultimately, and I think, question 7. The ordinance was for a month. Why didn't Daniel just close his windows for a month? He could have still prayed. Maybe they wouldn't have known. It's only for a month. After the end of the month, the law expired. He could have went back to doing it like he was doing it before. Why not just for the month? And again, we don't want to put something man-made over God. Do we ever make excuses similar to one like that? It's just for a short period of time, and it'll be okay. Do we ever do that?
We do that all the time. We excuse things, come up with reasons.
Yeah. And it's pretty amazing the reasons we come up with at times. Which is why, some of you have heard me say it before, the next time you want to use an excuse, just say you're out of peanut butter, because that's just as good as anything else that you're going to say. And hopefully it makes you realize that the excuse you were about to use is pretty lame. you see this play out in our society a lot. We say it's just for this short period of time and it'll be okay. And then I'll get back into the groove of things. We do this, and we're in the midst of this one right now. We do this during hunting season. We do this during sports seasons. You name whatever season it is. For those that like it, we can do that. Now, am I saying that we have to be in church every time, every week? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the life that we live for God should not change. We cannot set aside our service unto Him. We cannot set aside our dedication unto Him. I'm not saying we have to walk into a building every week and that's the only way we can maintain our relationship with God. Is it important? Yes, I think it's important. But it's more about what we do day in, day out than it is walking into a building on a Sunday. Now, I say that's probably the worst thing for a pastor to ever say, but please understand, we want you to be here. But at the same time, it's not about you being here. It's about you living day to day what God wants you to live. Because you can walk in the door of this church every week, every Sunday, every Wednesday. You can walk in the door of this church and you can go out Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday and live a terrible life. And walking in this church building on Sunday and Wednesday does nothing for you.
We're also teaching our children what we value and how to make decisions when they get older.
Sure.
Are they going to go to church when they don't feel like it? Are they going to make excuses?
Are they going to be out of peanut butter? The daily life lived for God, as we see in Daniel, is extremely important. Please don't depend upon being in a service to make your life right. It is extremely valuable. I don't want to take anything away from that. But your daily time with God is the most important thing that you can have. Because chances are, Satan is probably not going to attack you as much on Sunday as he is on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. That's when we need to make sure we are in the Word, as well as Sunday. I'm not taking that away. Now, do I think it's valuable to be here? Sure I do. How else could you hear what I just said unless you were here? And I'm not saying what I said was earth-shattering. I'm just saying we don't get... The hardest thing for us to do, someone said that this morning, hardest thing for us to do is to self-evaluate, to look in the mirror ourselves and say, these are the faults that I have in life. But when we stand or sit and we're in amongst people to where we understand we're coming to actually grow in our relationship with God, and I'm going to be open for my toes to be stepped on, if you want to use that word, because of God's Word. Not what I say, but because of what God's Word says. When we open ourselves up for that, that's valuable in our life. And we typically have a hard time doing that if we're just sitting at home on our couch. That's why it's invaluable. It is extremely valuable for us to be a part of a body that comes together. I hope all that made sense and came out right. Question 8. If we look at Daniel chapter 9, verse 2, what does it seem that Daniel had in his possession? What would he have read in chapter 32, verse 27 of this book? And do you think that Daniel would need this reassurance as he knew what the injunction would be if he continued to pray to God? So, looking at chapter 9, verse 2, if you want to flip over there, a few pages. Let's start in verse 1. Verse 1 of chapter 9 says, "In the first year of Darius the son of Ahasuerus, by descent a Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years." What does it seem that Daniel had in his possession? Or at least had access to? Of who?
Jeremiah, probably also the Torah.
Yeah. from this verse, we can at least say he had the writings of Jeremiah. We can at least say that. And from that, we find that he understands that in about 70 years, Jerusalem will be restored. How encouraging would that be to someone who has been a captive for the ballpark of 65 years? How encouraging would that be if you're in chapter 6 of Daniel's life and you have those, and you know that at some point God is going to change this whole situation that you're in, and the Israelites are going to be able to go back to their homeland. He realizes by reading that God is not done with them. We have also, for us, we have writings that pertain to the future in our life as well. And those writings give us the hope that what we're living through right now is not the end, but that there's a life after this. And we place our hope in that eternal home that we talk about, but we also know that we have to live faithfully here and now, just as Daniel was doing. And so we have, again, I think it was valuable for Daniel to have the writings of, whether it was just Jeremiah or whether it was others as well. We know Jeremiah from this. I think it was valuable for him to have that because God spoke through Jeremiah, told him what was going to happen in the future. Daniel's able to read that and knows, okay, this is not the end. We're not only going to die as exiles here and the Israelites not have any type of future, which God had promised the remnant would always remain. But he has an assurance that what he knew before is going to be restored at some point in time. 70 years is what he perceives in this.
You go back, go back in the verse that we just looked at, the previous question, verse 10, and when he was praying, and he doesn't give a list of things that he wants or needs. It says that he gives thanks unto his God.
He does. That's exactly right. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. It's a great point, because just because his situation changed for the worse doesn't mean that it changed Daniel's prayer. He still gave thanks to God. Do we, look at question 9. Do we agree with the statement made by Richard Baxter? He was a Puritan preacher. Here was his statement. He said, God's people should be more concerned that they deserve the persecution than that they be delivered from it, because deserving it would be evidence of their faithfulness to the Lord. What do you think of that? Should we be more concerned that we deserve the persecution, or more concerned to be delivered from the persecution? Now, the human side of us would say, I want to be delivered from it, right? I don't want to go into a lion's den. If we go into kind of some more recent events, and these are a few years old now, and I think I've referenced this before, but over in, I think it was Iraq or Iran 1, there was 26 guys that were dressed in orange jumpsuits that were beheaded because of their faith in Christ, and they wouldn't denounce. We would much rather be delivered from something like that than to live through it. But is that what we should be the most concerned about? Now, we don't want persecution to come just for persecution's sake, right? But notice his statement. He said we should be more concerned that we deserve persecution. In other words, that others see us as followers of God, and because of that, persecution would come. Do we see any example in the New Testament where someone somewhat ask if there's a way of deliverance, let it happen, but if not, let your will be done. Kind of gave it away, didn't I? The garden, right before his arrest. What does Jesus say?
Let this cup pass from me.
But,
Right, I couldn't finish it, so I just stopped.
oh, okay. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. In other words, my human heart would really not like to have to go through this. But ultimately, I want your will done. And that really should be where every one of us is. I don't think it's wrong for us to have this desire to not have to face a beheading or a lion's den or whatever you want to throw out there. But at the same time, if that's what God's will is, we should be okay with that. That's hard to say. It's even harder to think about. And it's even harder to think about that for your child's life or your grandchild's life. Because what if your grandchild said, or your child said, I want to go be a missionary in Iraq? What are you going to say to that? Do what? I'm going with you. As long as we went for the right reason, that'd be okay. But we have to be okay with that too. In question 10 then. Verse 14 says that the king was much distressed. What do you think was bothering him the most? So verse 14 is after they throw Daniel in, or I'm sorry, before they throw him in, but after he knows he's got to do this. The king, when he heard the words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. What do you think was bothering him the most?
He knew the law that he set in place was wrong.
At that point, he knew it was wrong. He didn't really think about it too much on the front end, did he? So the law that he put in place, he realized now was not a good law. What else?
Well, Daniel was his friend. I mean, he was a good man and a good leader, and he held him in high esteem. And being tricked like that,
Yeah. He got, I used this word this morning, he got duped. He did. This was the guy that he was fixing to put second in command, so to speak, second in command. And now he's fixing to have to throw him in the lion's den, and he don't want to do that. But he has to, because in that law, in the Medes and Persians, once a law was put in place, it could not be revoked. It had to play out. So he couldn't change it. It's not like today where a legislature could go in and reverse a law that's been passed, so to speak. They couldn't do that. Even though the king had power to make laws, he couldn't reverse one that had been made. And so he's got to go through with it. You think he was irritated with the guys? Not Daniel, but the others?
You throw them in a den of lions.
Yeah.
24 says it all. He threw the kids and their wives.
Yeah. And that's an interesting, because there's some cultural things behind that. So among pagan people, at this day and time, I'm talking, pagan people was if an individual, whether it be husband or wife, if they done evil, then typically the children, the parents, and the children, and if there's grandchildren, would all be executed. Because in a pagan culture, if you do harm to an individual and they've got a child that's alive, at some point, what's that child going to want to do? Revenge. Because again, pagan culture, this is not a godly, grace-filled person's life. We live in a society that we know we have to show forgiveness at some point in time. If someone wrongs us, our child, whoever it may be, the thing that we're taught is that there has to be forgiveness in our heart. In a pagan culture, that doesn't exist. So, to what Andrew brought up, they didn't only kill these men, they killed their whole family. And when I say kill, they threw them in the lion's den. The lions took care of it. So they were all gone.
Well,
He did. There's also another time, too, if you remember when they made the golden calf, golden image, they destroyed the families then, too, which was a direction from God. Now, the actual law, Israelite law, was not, and I forget where it's listed, I have to look that up, but it actually states that if a man commits evil, his father shall not be punished for him, and his son should not be punished for him. But now, if they were involved in it, then they were all done. And that was a kind of a special time because God knew that evil was going to continue on unless it was stopped within the Israelite group. All right, question 11. Was the king praying to God in verse 16, or was he making a statement to Daniel? So look at verse 16. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought, cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." Was he praying to God, or was he making a statement to Daniel? Seems to be a statement to Daniel. He's not calling out to God for God to intervene. At this point, we don't know. What it seems is that he don't know if God can deliver him or not. I think that's worth us noting because when you get over to verse 27, notice what he says, because this is his decree that he makes after this is all done. And he says, he, meaning God, delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. I think that's an interesting statement because he throws in there the power of the lions. We know, I don't think any of you have been like up close and personal with a lion. Maybe if you have, I'd love to hear your story and why you're still here right now. But if we were, we know lion is extremely powerful, right? You see when they throw these other people in, that before they hit bottom, they're tore limb from limb. The king is acknowledging that God has more power than maybe one of the most powerful animals they recognize on the earth at this point in time. This isn't fully understanding God, but it's a start to understanding who God is. Because he now says he's able to deliver and rescue. He works signs and wonders, not only in heaven, but also on earth. He's beginning to get it. I'm not saying he's got it, but he's beginning to see it at least. Question 12, why do you think that the king was restless all night? Was this God working on him? Was it him feeling responsible for his actions? Yes, to both.
He's feeling guilty.
Probably distraught for Daniel too.
Distraught for Daniel. Again, he's probably a little bit irritated that he got tricked as well. I think he truly wants, because at this point, you got to remember too, in this hierarchy, he's the king. If these people have tricked him and they've taken out the number one person that he could trust, he's got to be a little bit scared for what this means going forward too, because he can't trust them anymore. I do believe that God was probably working on him as well. You ever been completely miserable because you know God's working on your heart? Maybe prior to salvation, maybe you had some moments like that. Maybe even after salvation, you had some moments like that. But you know what, if you've had that, you know what it feels like. And so when it says, where is it? Verse 18, then the king went to his palace and spent the night. Notice what he was doing? Fasting. He didn't eat. Probably didn't have the stomach to eat. We know that when we get extremely upset, we don't want to eat in those times. He was fasting, and no diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. What's a diversion? Entertainment. So in those days, they didn't have TV. They didn't have radio. Tonight, if you go home tonight and you can't sleep, what are you going to do? Eat a bowl of cereal and put on TV. We'll probably either watch TV, maybe listen to something. I used to say radio. Nobody listens to radio anymore, maybe. But a podcast, whatever it is. Or you're going to read a book. right? They had diversions, is what they call it. Some people might read a book. They had diversions or entertainment, which could have been a number of things that would have been brought to him at his command to entertain him while he could not sleep. And notice it says none of them were brought to him. He was not distracted from how terrible he felt, anguish that he felt at that moment in time. Should he have felt that way? Probably so, especially if God was working on his heart. He wasn't being distracted from what was going on. Question 13 from verse 23, what was the reason given that no harm was found on Daniel? He trusted in God. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. It was a den of lions. He was thrown in, right? Had to be lifted out. So thrown in. There wasn't a ladder. It doesn't appear that he climbed down into this pit. He was thrown in. How old was he? 80. And when you were a teenager, maybe early 20s, jumping off something, you could pretty well land on your feet, right? When you get up about 50, you quit jumping off things. You're supposed to quit jumping off things anyway, although sometimes you still think you're about 20 and you do it anyway. When you get to 80, are you jumping off anything? You're not even jumping up on your feet from where you're sitting at 80, right? I don't mean that bad. I mean, we just don't. Physically, we just don't do that. Daniel's thrown down into the pit. Now, granted, the lions did not harm him, and that's a tremendous miracle. But also realize from him going down into the pit, he had no harm from that either. God protected him in all ways of this. And I think that's obviously shutting the lions' mouths, because in that day and time, what they would do is they would not feed the lions for a period of time. They didn't want the lions to have a full belly before they threw somebody in there. So they didn't feed them for a period of time so that they'd be good and hungry whenever they throw somebody in so that it's done. These lions weren't sitting there because they weren't hungry. They were sitting there because God closed their mouths. And he would not let them harm, which again tells us that God has power over all of creation. Question 14, are God's people always saved from harm? Don't we wish we could say yes to that? From an earthly standpoint, we wish we could say yes to that. But God's people are not always saved from harm. Do we have examples of that? We have Daniel, right? Do we have other examples in the Bible of that? Paul, in what ways?
Shipwrecks, he was in jail, beaten,
Okay.
almost stoned to death.
Yeah. Stephen, what we have recorded is the first martyr in the New Testament for his faith, I should say. Someone said someone else. What about John, New Testament? What do we know about John? All the apostles, we would say. John was a guy that is, for the most part, fully believed he was put in a pot of boiling oil and lived through that. Christ as well, yeah. Which we know that was a grander, that we needed that to happen, right? John lived through it. Now it's a unique one because John was actually intended to be put to death, but he lived through it. And then we have the book of Revelation after that was given to us. But you know what eventually happened to John? He died. What eventually happened to Daniel? He died, right? He didn't hear because God protected him. He had more for Daniel to do. But God's people are not always saved from harm, and we have to realize that God has an overall plan. We have to be willing to go along with God's plan, even when it doesn't look good for us. From a human perspective, it doesn't look good. Question 15, why do you think the families were destroyed along with the evil men? Kind of answered that already. In that day and time, they made sure that there wasn't a threat to the king. And so they would take out whole families so that revenge was not an option, so to speak. Last question, question 16. What does Proverbs 26:27 provide for us? If you want to flip over there, it's worth flipping over for. Proverbs 26:27. These evil guys thought they had everything figured out. Thought they had everything figured out. But notice what verse 27 tells us. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. And a stone will come back on him who starts it rolling. Kind of unique that there was a stone that covered up the mouth to the den of lions. They didn't literally dig this den of lions, so to speak, but they began the process of it being used here in this circumstance, and now they're finding that this is their end. What they meant to do for evil actually came back on them because they had no remorse, it appears. They had no turning to God. We find that the king seems to have a change of heart in terms of his thoughts about God. I'm not saying he was perfect. I'm not saying he was saved, to use that word that we use today. But I am saying he's different than what he was before. These guys we don't have any record of what their thoughts were after this. They didn't have a chance. The king was so upset with them, they were just done. And he took care of them. I think it's important for us to realize that we should never have evil intent towards someone else. And if we do, chances are we're going to end up paying for it. While God's people do have to go through harm sometimes, remember that God always has a plan for that. There will be someone that will be impacted in a positive way from that. We can always look back and see that. And I think we can always, I'm going to say 99% of the time we can look back and see it. We have a hard time seeing it in the moment. But this is where faith comes in, of we trust God regardless. Daniel, if you go back to chapter 6, it was his custom. It was his practice. It's what he done daily, that he went and he prayed to God. He served God daily. He done that when things were going right and well in his eyes. He done that when the situation changed. And he knew, when this injunction was made, he knew where he was going to end up. I think he had no doubt what was going to happen, unless God intervened, I'll say that. But he knew from an earthly perspective this was what was going to happen. But it doesn't change him. And you and I have to get to that spot, to where when our circumstances change, we don't change in our faith with God, in the way that we live, unless we get closer to God. That's the only change that should happen. It should never be further away. It should be closer, if anything. Daniel he didn't really have to make much of a change because he was close to God. And that's where you and I need to be. The only way that we'll weather the storm that comes in the future, the circumstance that's terrible, the only way we'll weather that is if we prepare for it ahead of time. And Daniel had spent 65 years. Did Daniel get to this spot in his faith like that? How did it begin? Going all the way back, his parents, we assume, taught him, because he was Jewish and he had the faith. We assume his parents taught him as they were instructed to do, Deuteronomy chapter 6, right? Move forward a little bit to that. Chapter 1 of Daniel, what do we find?
Still diligent in his faith.
If you remember, he was brought the king's food. He was instructed he was supposed to eat the king's food. And what did he say? Give us 10 days. Was it 10 days, I think? 10 days. Give us 10 days. Let us eat what God says will not defile us. And if we don't look good after this period of time, it was longer than 10, wasn't it? Was it 40 days? Was it 10? Okay. What's that? If we don't look good after that, if we look terrible after that, we'll change. But let's give God a chance to work. Do you think that built Daniel's faith? Go to, is it chapter 3, I think it is, that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? Do you think Daniel knew about what happened to them? How does a story like that not get out? Like the guy that's going to throw them in actually gets consumed by fire, and they survive actually going in. How does that not spread? Daniel had to know about that. These are some of his closest friends. Do you think that built Daniel's faith? Sure it did. You find every situation, Daniel interprets the dreams. What does that do for him after he sees what God gives him the ability to do? It has to build his faith. We have to find moments in our life that are faith builders and not explain them away as this is just a coincidence that this happened. But we have to realize God is giving us those moments in time so that we're ready for when we're thrown into the lion's den at some point in our life. And if we don't recognize those moments where we don't eat the king's food, but we eat what God says won't defile us, if we don't recognize those moments as God providing for us in that time, then we'll never get to the spot where we can withstand the lion's den, because we've never given glory unto God. We've never recognized what God's doing in our life. We've always explained it away earthly. Don't miss what God has done for you. If you have to go backwards in life and start thinking about how God has worked, it is valuable for you to do that. Your testimony is a huge, important piece of your life. And it's not just for your value, it's for your family's value as well. We're reading Daniel from 4,000 years ago. We're reading it tonight. Do you think Daniel ever thought, you know, if I will just remain faithful through this lion's den, then Kevin in the year 2025 will be teaching about me? You think he thought it? Only if there was a dream about it, probably. He had no idea. He wasn't doing it just for the benefit of others. He was doing it because it's what he wanted to do. But the benefit, it's what he knew he needed to do. But the benefit is for others. And it's the same way in your life. When we do what we know we need to do in service to God, it will benefit other people. And when you write it down so that others can read it at some point in the future, it will benefit them as well. Just the same as Daniel's life is benefiting us tonight. There's value in it. Don't miss what God has done in your life already to build your faith, to make it through whatever den of lions you have to make it through. Pray with me tonight if you would. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray tonight that we would realize you working in our life. I pray that we not be blind to your goodness, your grace, and your mercy that you've shown to us from the time that we were born until where we sit tonight. I pray, Lord, that you would bring to mind, even tonight, when we depart from here, as we drive home, as we get to our homes, I pray that you would bring to mind for each one of us something that you have done for us in order to build our faith so that we might know that we can make it through whatever obstacle we face. I thank you for your faithfulness to us, that even before we loved you, you loved us. You sent your Son for us. Help us as a body of believers, as a church, as a community that has believers scattered throughout. Let us all, as a body, be faithful to proclaim and live the life that you've called us to live, so that others might see you through us. I pray this in your Son's name, Jesus the Christ. Amen.